Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture series called Civic Engagement, Fair Trade, and Indigenous Gender Politics in Guatemala by Caryn Maxim. It's called Caryn Maxim Lecture Series. This is the first one of the weekly 10-week-long lecture on her experience of working with Indigenous Maya Mam women from Guatemala, Cajola, Guatemala. We are very lucky to have her. We have been working together for many years, and she has been working with many Ramapo professors. But this time, she is giving us real life experience of what it's like to be working with people in Guatemala. So thank you very much for being here, Caryn, and please go ahead.
So thank you very much, Neriko. I've been invited to share with you over the course of the next 10 lectures what I have done and what I have learned in my experiences working in an Indigenous community in Guatemala over the past 18 years, focusing on the work I have done with the Maya Mam Weaving Cooperative. Until the pandemic, I spent 2 weeks of every month in Guatemala, assisting Grupo Cajola in Cajola. That is the name of the group that I work with, in their work to develop their town so people don't need to migrate in order to have a dignified life. Ramapo College has been a part of that story for nearly all of those years. We have been grateful for the many professors, volunteers, interns, and visitors that have helped us along the way. Thank you for inviting me to share my story. Back when it started, I had my own business as a South American tour operator, but I wanted to do something more, something to give back, something that would make a difference. Looking around my town of Morristown, I could see that there was a large population of immigrants from Central America, who I soon discovered were mostly undocumented workers. Through my church, I began to volunteer to work with them, and I began to learn about their lives as undocumented workers here in the United States. I stood on the street corners talking with the day workers. I also opened my house for people to be able to come with their problems, and I would help them look for solutions one by one. I met Eduardo, a co-founder of Grupo Cajola, when he and I were both invited to participate on the mayor's committee that had been formed to decide what should be done about the undocumented day laborers waiting for work on the street. The shopkeepers were angry that they were standing on the sidewalk in front of their stores while they were waiting for work. Eduardo was a day laborer and a natural community leader and organizer. Although in the end the committee was not able to find a solution and was disbanded, I had been impressed by Eduardo. Sometime later, Eduardo was shot in the face in the middle of one night, a victim of mistaken identity. Some of his friends asked if he could come to my house to recuperate. He ended up living with my husband and myself for 2.5 years. During that time, I got to know him and Grupo Cajola very well. As he began to recover, he resumed meetings with Grupo Cajola, using my house for the meetings, and eventually including me. Grupo Cajola is named for Eduardo's hometown, Cajola, a town of about 18,000 people in the western highlands of Guatemala. Several hundred people from Cajola were living in Morristown. There are about 7,000 people from Cajola living in the United States, about 40% of the town's population. They are scattered all over the U.S., with about 1,000 in Atlanta, Georgia, 1,000 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, about 3,000 in Los Angeles, and smaller groups in Minneapolis, Maryland, Morristown, and various other towns. Grupo Cajola was formed after a young man from Cajola was hit by a car while he was riding his bicycle in Morristown. The hospital and the Guatemalan consulate sent him back to Guatemala, where, without access to care, he died within a few days. The guys were horrified. He was a part of their community, and they thought that if they had gotten involved in his case, maybe he wouldn't have died. They vowed never to let that happen again. During their Sunday soccer game, they decided they had to organize to look out for each other, and Grupo Cajola was born, to look out for each other here in the U.S. They started out by helping each other when they were sick and raising money to return to Cajola the bodies of those who died here. People ask, why do they spend $10,000 to send a body back? It is because of the strong connection the Maya people have with their land. So it is important to return to their land even if they've passed on. That practical work continues today. I'd like to give you a very short history of Guatemala. The history of Guatemala begins with the story of the Maya people. They have been in the Americas since 2500 BC. They are known for their amazing classical culture in the that was rich with art, architecture, writing, astronomy, and mathematics. At the time the Spanish arrived, they were no longer living in the grand cities, but were living in dispersed communities. And over time, 22 different ethnic groups and languages had evolved. The people of Cajola are from the Mam ethnic group, one of the 4 largest in Guatemala. The invasion by the Spanish in 1524 realized a cultural and physical genocide. Their land was stolen, they were forced into slavery and forced to accept the Catholic Church, or they were tortured and killed. The church provided the ideological support to the conquistadors to justify this treatment. These were savages and not really humans. In addition, the church burned all of their books except for the 3 or 4 which have survived. The invasion by the Spanish set the scene for today. There is still an enormous divide between the oligarchy that rules Guatemala, many of whom are descended from the Spanish colonists, and the huge majority of peasants who are indigenous or mestizo, but all very poor. This enormous divide characterizes all the history of Guatemala since 1524, with various governments enacting various repressive laws over the years against the indigenous. Laws that required forced labor, laws that required the people to stay on the plantation where they were working or be killed. The only exception in all these years is what is called the Peaceful Revolution and the 10 years of Democratic Spring. The Peaceful Revolution was, in fact, that. A peaceful revolution brought on by nonviolent protests by professors, students, labor leaders, indigenous, peasants, and military, and led to the overthrow of the dictator Jorge Ubico. This was followed by 2 democratically elected presidents, the only 2 presidents in the entire history of Guatemala to try to run the country for the benefit of all its residents. The second president was Jacobo Arbenz, who enacted a mild land reform to take unused land and distribute it to the indigenous and peasants. Since some of this unused land was owned by the United Fruit Company, who are predecessors to today's Chiquita, the CIA organized an invasion of Guatemala in 1954, overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, and installed someone more to their liking. In 1960, rooted in this coup of 1954, the 36 years of brutal civil war began. The U.S. portrayed the war as communist, but in truth, it was a revolt by the peasants and indigenous against the oligarchy and military. The United States provided considerable aid using the national security doctrine and its concept of an internal enemy as a justification. They provided arms and money and trained the Guatemala military in counterinsurgency techniques that included torture. It has been shown that the U.S. Army personnel were even involved in the torture of American citizens. However, the Guatemala government and military were capable of horrendous acts on their own. Under Rios Montt's government, more than 440 communities were razed to the ground. During the course of the war, more than 200,000 primarily indigenous people were killed and 40,000 disappeared. 1 million went into exile. Peace accords were negotiated to end the war and were signed in 1996. That was the same year that Eduardo migrated to the United States. Important to our story, the Accord on Identity and Rights of Indigenous People outlined everything that would be done to ensure that Indigenous people have equal rights to a dignified life. Sadly, almost nothing from this or most of the other accords has been implemented now that we're 26 years later. The peace accords also created a United Nations Truth Commission to investigate the war. And this investigation concluded that the government and the military had been responsible for 97% of the deaths, with the guerrillas responsible for 3%, and that, in fact, genocide had been committed. The war had a huge impact in Kahola. Some people were guerrillas fighting for democracy. Some went voluntarily into the army. Some were forced into the army. Some lived in the mountains in towns in resistance, and some were forced to become paramilitaries, essentially spying on their neighbors. When I first worked in Kahola, I never heard anyone talk about the war, even when we were talking about their history. It was as if there had never been a war. I only heard talks of repression that predated the war. The young men of Kahola had an aha moment. They began to understand why they had to migrate. Before learning their history, they thought they had to migrate because they were poor, that their grandparents hadn't struggled enough. But now they began to understand they were poor because of the structural poverty and discrimination in their country, the structural divide between the oligarchy and the rest of the people. Since the war had occurred in their lifetimes, they could also begin to put into context things they had seen or knew about during those years. And it ended up inspiring them to return to Kahola and organize to develop the community and eliminate the need to migrate. In 2022, Guatemalan migrants living in the U.S. sent back $18 billion in remittances, nearly 20% of Guatemala's GNP. When you visit Kahola, you will see lots of beautiful houses in the center, and you will think it's not a poor town. But a closer look reveals that those houses are empty because their owners are in the United States. And the tragedy is that with so many families split up, the social fabric of Kahola is disintegrating. Grupo Kahola is trying to change that. I visited Kahola for the first time in 2003 to get to know Eduardo's family. On my return, I told him, "Your town is beautiful, but life is way too hard." When Eduardo decided he would return to Kahola with the dream to develop his town, I decided to accompany him. I began my monthly 2-week visits in 2005 when 2 of the guys from the group returned to Kahola. Our first project was building Kahola's first internet center. And at the same time, I started organizing women, beginning with the family members of Grupo Kahola in Morristown. Next week, I will be talking about how that organizing resulted in the Maya Mam Weaving Cooperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caryn. This is just a note. This is a recording because of the technical difficulty during the actual presentation. Thank you very much for taking time to record this again, Caryn, and looking forward to later lectures, more lectures. Thank you.
Okay.